Welcome. Again, my name is Stephanie, and I work for an organization called Barnabas Fund. And Barnabas Fund, we do a lot of work with the persecuted church around the world. And one thing that we've been focusing on a lot recently, and pretty much the media and a lot, is this group called ISIS, Islamic State. And so one thing that we do as an organization, church, we do a lot of aid and relief work, but we also try to help people understand a bit more about Islam and what Islam is, what Muslims believe, and that kind of thing. So we do have a stand at the back of the main session room, and there's quite a few books if you're wanting to kind of get a little bit more information about Islam. But today we're going to focus on Islamic State and talk about some of the ideology and theology behind Islamic State. So welcome. No worries. No worries. Have a seat. So Al-Qaeda shocked the world and staggered the U.S. when it attacked the Twin Towers and the Pentagon on September 11th in 2001. We all remember that. Hamas and Palestinian Jihad maintain steady pressure on Israel, while Hezbollah menaces Israel from Lebanon. In the Philippines, through the work of Islamic Jihad groups, Muslims have secured an autonomous region in Mindanao. And in Nigeria, the group Boko Haram caught attention of even Michelle Obama, who launched the campaign on Twitter with the hashtag #BringBackOurGirls. Boko Haram had attacked the Chibok village and kidnapped over 200 young girls to sell them into sex slavery and marry them off as young brides. But the terror of one group has outdone them all with its brutality. We watched this scene on TV, 21 Coptic Christians who were marched out onto a beach and who were killed and martyred for their faith. So we watched this group march these 21 men out onto the beach. We watched as they beheaded these men simply because they were Christians. We also watched this group burn a man alive, a Jordanian pilot. They burned him alive in a metal cage. We watched as Yazidi girls were captured and loaded onto trucks and taken as war booty to be sold into sex slavery or raped repeatedly by ISIS fighters. The group's terror rivals the atrocities of Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, Mao. Their terror has captured the horror and attention of the world. This group, of course, is the group we're talking about today, ISIS. The Islamic State has become the first terror group to rule over significant expanses of territory for an extended period of time. It's won the loyalty of jihadists all over the world. This group has been able to put out their war cry, their jihad, and attract people from even outside of their domain in the Middle East. They've attracted people from Libya, Nigeria, even the Philippines. It has called for attacks in the West, and Muslims from the U.S., Britain, even Australia have answered its call. Yet despite this and more, we still know very little about ISIS. And that's the thing. It's not just us who know very little about ISIS. It seems like nations' leaders know very little about ISIS as well. Hillary Clinton has said, whether you call them ISIS or ISIL, I refuse to call them Islamic or a state. And most of the world leaders agree with her. President Obama, Vice President Joe Biden, David Cameron, and many other Western leaders have agreed that the Islamic State had nothing to do with Islam. Even other major Muslim groups in the West condemn the Islamic State and question its claims to a caliphate or even that it's Islamic at all. So here's the deal. We have this group called the Islamic State. Many of us don't know too much about them, which is why we're here today. And even nations' leaders know very little about them. We see media come and say that they're not Islamic. You know, we see President Obama stand up and say Islam is a religion of peace, so there's no way that Islamic State has anything to do with Islam at all. Meanwhile, by February of 2015, over 20,000 Muslims from all over the world had traveled to Syria and Iraq to fight jihad. This Islamic State, and with the nations calling them not Islamic, had drawn in thousands of people from all over the world to come and fight jihad. And this is a group that there's been no other terror group who has heeded that kind of call. That's what's so crazy about this group, Islamic State. The Islamic State is the wealthiest, most successful, and the most dangerous terror group in the world, and the most mysterious, right? I mean, we see that this group, Islamic State, is worth over $2 billion. $2 billion. And so today we're going to talk a lot about the theology, what they think, their ideology. We're going to talk about history, where they came from, how they started. What are some things that you guys already know about Islamic State? Just maybe raise your hand and let us know kind of what you already know about Islamic State.
Nothing.
Nothing, okay? That's where most of us are, eh? The hope is today that we walk out of here knowing a little bit more about Islamic State. The problem is that, hi, there's a spot right there if you want to. Like I said before, the thing is that most of us have only heard what media has told us about Islamic State. And the media does a pretty good job sometimes of giving us news and things like that, but a lot of times media is very jaded to one way. And you see a lot of media talking about Islamic State, and like I said before, they're referring to Islamic State as not Islamic at all. So we need to know more about this group ISIS, because I think that ISIS is not going anywhere for a while. They've been around for a while, even before the news started talking about them, even before we saw the first beheading video. They've been around for a while, and they're very strong, and they've got what it takes to be a successful terrorist group. So we do need to know as much as we can about ISIS, and more than what the media is telling us even, and even better, a Christian perspective of what ISIS is. So that when we have conversations with people, we can kind of clear things up, Because if we only listen to the media, we're only going to have that side of it. It's so good to have a bigger, broader idea of it. So before we get started, first of all, is there anything else that you guys know about ISIS that, just kind of off the top of your heads?
Violent.
Very violent.
Went down offshoot, extremist offshoot of the Taliban.
Yeah, Al-Qaeda, yeah. Yep, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well.
They seem to move around. They're not based in one sort of spot. The original communist group in China, they kept moving around and whatever.
Yeah, and it's about getting more territory. Like most war is about getting more territory and things like that. That's what ISIS is about. And more than that, it's a religious thing for them as well. So before we get started, we're going to talk about some buzzwords. We're just going to kind of get these out in the air so that when I do talk about them, we have a basis. I'm really sorry about how small this is for those of you in the back. I'll try to read them out loud so you can hear them. So some of the buzzwords. Caliphate. This is basically Islamic State, not ISIS as the group, but an Islamic State under an authoritative Muslim leader, the Caliph. Sharia. This is Islamic law, seen as divinely ordained based on the Islamic source text of the Quran, Hadith, and applies to all spheres of life, including politics. Sharia law encompasses everything. It encompasses religion, lifestyle, rules, politics, all of that. Daesh is the Arabic acronym for ISIL, for ISIS. This is basically what people in the Middle East will call ISIS. They call them Daesh. And the ISIS hates to be called this. They don't like that term. But if you hear somebody refer to Daesh, that's the acronym, the Arabic acronym for them. Takfir, that is the judgment and proclamation of other Muslim rulers, regimes, societies, and individuals as apostate, infidel, and heretical. So one of the things that ISIS is doing is and a lot of ISIS is killing other Muslims, which seems kind of weird because they're a Muslim group. So why would they want to kill other Muslims? What they believe is this takfir, which is they believe that Muslims have gone away from the original root of Islam. And so what takfir is basically calling other Muslims, Shiites, other Muslim minority groups, this word, and that basically lists them as an apostate and actually makes them legitimate targets of ISIS. You've seen ISIS referred to as ISIL, Islamic State of the Levant, and that's basically the region, that's Greater Syria. In the Middle East, it's known as Greater Syria, and this is the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, north of the Arabian Peninsula, south of Turkey, and includes usually Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, and Syria. Salafi Jihadi, this is emphasis. It's a Muslim group with the emphasis on the importance of returning to pure Islam, mostly by means of jihad, which is what ISIS is one of their main beliefs. It is a specific ideological and theological movement in Sunni Islam that includes militant groups and global networks of scholars, websites, media outlets, and numerous supporters on social media. The root is Salaf, which are the pious ancestors of the first 3 Muslim generations. So again, this is another emphasis of Islam, the Salafi jihadi emphasis, which is returning to pure Islam, returning back to the roots of what Islam is. A lot of these terrorist groups basically believe this kind of takfir and Salafi jihadi mentality, where they want, the reason why they fight jihad is because they think that they've gone too far away from Muslim roots, and so that's their way to get them back. Jahiliyyah is any society not fully under Sharia law. Jihad is holy war against unbelievers or infidels. And another couple words is a kafir. So I don't have this on here, but it's basically when ISIS says kafir, it basically means unbelievers. So everybody in this room is a kafir. We're all unbelievers. Shiites, Muslims are kafir. They're unbelievers. They don't believe in what ISIS believes as pure Islam. And Mujahideen are those engaged in jihad. So those are basically the fighters. Those are the ones who are fighting jihad for the greater cause of Allah. So those are some buzzwords. So if I say them, hopefully we can kind of remember some of these. I'm going to talk more about the caliphate later and talk about what that means. And then, but basically all these other words will just kind of be used throughout today's seminar. So the Islamic State. And also, if you can't hear me for some reason, just kind of raise your hand so that I know. I've never been accused of not talking loud enough, so it's not a problem. Some people do say because of my American accent, I talk too fast. I've been referred to as Mickey Mouse before, so yeah. So if I talk too fast or I'm not talking loud enough, just kind of raise your hand and I'll try to up the level a bit, okay? So Islamic State is a radical Islamist Sunni Salafi, which is what we talked about here, jihadi organization that aims at establishing a caliphate under Sharia, first in Iraq and then in all the other Arab states and finally the whole world. So ISIS is, right now, they're thinking Middle East. They're thinking Syria and Iraq, gain as much land as they can, have this caliphate, start to run this caliphate like a state, which is what they're doing. They've got their own passports, they've got their own monetary system, banks, all of that stuff in the territories that they've taken over. In Raqqa, one of the main, where they've kind of have their capital, they have literally started to govern and run it as a state. Okay, so they're very smart, very strategic. They're not some just crazy a terrorist group that just wants to blow things up, okay? They have a system. And they want this caliphate to start out in Iraq and Syria, to spread in through the Middle East, and then eventually all of us to be under Sharia law, okay? It's important to understand how the group's ideology has been inspired by Islamic radical thought and to have a clear assessment of how ISIS ideology relates to ideologies present in Muslim mainstream and to key historical and theological traditions within Islam. So right here, this debunks the whole media idea of them not being Islamic, because what they're doing is rooted in history, in Islamic history. One example of this is this flag, this black flag right here. We've all seen this flag. Media has shown this flag, but what we don't understand is the relevance of this flag, how important this flag is to the Islamic State. The news reports on the conflict of the civil war in Syria and Iraq. Westerners, all of us are familiar with this flag, and it's very few of us who fully grasp the significance of the symbolism it has or the sense of mission with which it empowers ISIS fighters. So we get this in New Zealand, right? We get that a flag is important. We have this big debate going on right now about what our next flag should be or if we should change our flag at all, right? So we understand that there's something more important to a flag than just what it looks like. There's a lot of us are deciding on whether or not with our flag here in New Zealand, what we want that to look like, what represents us. And this flag right here, this represents more than just a flag. It's not just a pretty symbol of Islamic State. This is to them empowering. This means something more. So this right here, this Arabic word, basically in Arabic says there is no God but Allah. Okay, so you've got that. That is a huge thing right there. That gives significance, great significance to the flag. It's in white, and then in the Arabic script and on plain black background. The name of Allah itself renders the flag powerful and sacred. And at its center is this right here. Now what this says is Muhammad, messenger of Allah. And what this is, and what scholars believe, is that this is the actual seal that Muhammad used when he was writing to fighters during his time. So this flag is significant, and it's also significant because what they believe as fighting under this flag is that they are ushering in an apocalypse. They're ushering in the end times. So just like what we believe similarly that there will be an end time, that Jesus will come back. And they believe that this flag is giving them the liberty to start the war that will bring back Jesus and then bring back the end times, and then basically Muslims will rule the world under this caliphate that they see as a perfect world. So a guy by the name of Mangus Reinstorp, he did theology studies at the Swedish National Defense College, points out that other groups have used this flag. The Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and the Al-Shabaab group in Somalia have all used the same flag. He goes on to say that the most important thing is the color. This was the Prophet Muhammad's war banner. This flag harks back to where they came from and where they are going. It's not just the color of jihad and of the caliphate, but it represents the coming of what some believers see as the final battle in the day of resurrection. There's a kind of end days element in the flag, pitting the forces of Islam against the Christian West. So, like I said, this flag is bigger than just to identify Islamic State. This is for Islamic State. This is their war banner, and what they want to do is bring back and usher in the end times.
Can I ask? You
Yeah.
mentioned end times, and we know that Jesus is coming then, and he's considered to be a prophet by then.
Mm-hmm.
Do they say that about the end times too?
Yeah.
Jesus will come as well, and so there will be two battles.
Yeah,
One by Jesus and one by Allah.
Yeah, Jesus will come back, but Jesus, his job is to basically annihilate anybody who's not a believer. Not our Jesus. It's not what we believe in. Yeah, their prophet Jesus. So it's a completely different end times. Interestingly enough, though, both Christianity and Islam believe that Jesus will come back. But in Islam, his coming back is not a good thing for Christians at all. So, yeah.
Where did their teaching on it, well, if you know, where did their teaching on Jesus come from if he is post-Muhammad?
Yeah, no, I'll do this quickly, but basically today we want to talk about ISIS, and we'll talk a little bit about theology and stuff, but questions about Islam and stuff like that, I'll try to answer some of them, but that's a whole nother talk. So to answer your question simply, Muslims believe a lot of the same things that we do. They believe in Moses, Abraham, that kind of stuff. Jesus, they view Jesus as a good man, a prophet, but not the greatest prophet. The greatest prophet is obviously Muhammad. Yeah. So, but in the simple version of that is that they do still believe in Jesus, even and their writings came after Christ. So, but again, whole nother topic for another day. Any other questions real quick on the flag?
I just have one with the Shahada, there is no God but Allah. How does ISIS reconcile that with the verse or the opening in the Quran that says, your God is our God?
They believe that the only God is Allah. Now, they do think, they do have some reverence for Christians. Some of the writings in the Quran are positive towards Christians, but they do think that Christians are a lower class than Muslims. So, again, that's another topic for another day.
Did you intentionally use the phrase Christian West?
What's that?
Did you intentionally use the phrase Christian West?
Yeah. So with Islamic State, they view the West as Christian. So they think no matter if you believe in God or not, in Christian God, they still think that anybody who comes from the West is a Christian. And that's their view. They think that we have all been misled and that we are all Christians. So unless you confess Allah as your God.
So they would actually assume that Western Christianity is actually true Christianity.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And even though that's such a broad, anybody, Australians, New Zealanders, anybody Western, British, any of those people are considered Christians in their eyes, not perfect Muslims.
What about other religions? How do they treat other religions like Buddhists?
Same. And this is, ISIS is anybody, even other Muslims who don't believe the same way that they do it, the pure Islam as they think it is, then you'll see that ISIS is killing more Muslims than anybody. They have declared war against other Muslims, and that word that I used before, the kafir, anybody who's not a believer. And by believer, I mean somebody who believes in the literal Quran, hadith, the words of Muhammad. So if they don't believe those things, even modern Muslims today, so you've got modern Muslims who will actually look at Islamic State and say that's not right, we don't take the Quran literally, but Islamic State says, yeah, we do take the Quran literally, we take what Muhammad did literally, what he said literally. So if you don't believe that, then you're considered a kafir or an infidel or apostate.
Can I just ask you, doesn't the word Allah mean God?
Yeah.
So they are saying they believe in God, but
Yeah.
they're using another word.
Yeah, but they still think that there is no God but Allah. But the Arabic word Allah means God.
Yeah.
So basically they're just saying, just like we believe that there's no other God but our God,
Right.
That's exactly what they're saying as well.
But the same God.
Different God or the same?
No, no, it's not. It's not the same God. We believe in a different God. They believe that God is Allah. They don't believe in the Christian God. They don't believe that our God that we believe in is Allah.
But still descended from Abraham and Isaac and...
Yeah. Okay.
The same lineage.
I understand. Hold on. Yeah. So here's the thing, guys. Today I want to talk about ISIS and what they believe. So if you have another question about Islam, come and talk to me afterwards. If you have a question about ISIS, then definitely bring that up. But otherwise, we're going to get sidetracked and actually walk out of here not knowing anything else, okay? All right. So let's talk about history. Where did the Islamic State come from, okay? So I know this is super hard to read, and I'll walk you through it. But basically, the origin and history of ISIS is really important. This group has demonstrated resilience. They have demonstrated that they are and have what it takes to be a successful terrorist group. And I think that it can be basically broken down into 5 eras. So I'm not going to go through every single little bit of this timeline, but this gives you kind of a good idea of, and I'll talk through the eras of it. So basically, the first era was this era right here, about 2002 to about 2004, okay? So what happened in 2002 was a guy by the name of Zakari. He created this really radical Islamist group called the Jamaat al-Tawhid wal Jihad, meaning unity of Allah and holy war. And he was the guy who led it. It was his ideology that kind of pushed this group onto the scene. He was a Jordanian Salafi jihadi who fought in Afghanistan before moving to Iraq in 2001. Zakari was more influenced by that takfiri, that thinking that Muslims were actually apostates if they didn't believe in the pure Islam. And so basically what that did was he had a lot of contempt and a lot of issued a lot of jihad on other Shiite Muslims who didn't believe the same. He kind of got together with the Al-Qaeda, and he was responsible for the group's extreme anti-Shiism and its focus on restoring the caliphate. So back in 2002, when Zakari stepped onto the scene, he had this really intense theology and wanting to come back and create this caliphate, a perfect world, taking everybody back to what pure Islam actually was. And so he sided with Al-Qaeda. And what they did was when the U.S., and this is how a lot of terrorist groups work, they use chaos and civil war to kind of catalyst their movements. And so they did that when the U.S. invaded Iraq, and they, defeated Saddam Hussein. This is when Zakari really made his move, and Al-Qaeda made their move. And they stepped onto the scene, and they really waged some serious war under a country who was now weakened. And so even though the U.S. thought they were doing a good thing, it caused this chaos, and it caused basically this open area for this terrorist group to really come onto the scene. And then the second era was 2004 to 2006. And this was when Zakari swore allegiance to Osama bin Laden and united the Al-Qaeda in Iraq with their group, the Jamaat al-Tawhid wal Jihad, and kind of combined forces. And they attacked Shia citizens. I mean, just really killed so many Muslims and wanted this, and all with the whole goal of this caliphate. So Zakari was a pretty nasty guy. And combining Zakari with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and it was just bad news everywhere, in Iraq especially. There was a period of weakness in 2006 through 2010, and what happened was the U.S. Basically engaged this force, and they attacked and killed Zakari in an airstrike. So this led to a bit of a weakness with this group. And at that time, when they joined forces, they named themselves the Islamic State of Iraq, or ISI. And then the Al-Qaeda in Iraq was basically the head group, but there was also this underlying ISI group as well. What happened when the U.S. engaged them is that they lost a lot of really strong leaders, and Zakari was killed, and then basically another guy, another big leader was killed at that point as well, a guy by the name of Mazrai. He was in charge of this Islamic State of Iraq at that point, and then another guy stepped onto the scene. Bakr al-Baghdadi became the new leader. Now, what happened with al-Baghdadi is he had gotten thrown into prison. So, it's super hot in here, eh? So when the U.S. kind of took over, they had killed Zakari. They had thrown a bunch of Saddam Hussein's main people into a prison, a U.S.-run prison. Now, this was a bit of a not good thing, because they ended up throwing all the bad guys in one big prison together. And yeah, so you know where I'm going with this. So Saddam Hussein's guys, if you know anything about that war and with the U.S. against Saddam Hussein, his party was called the Ba'athist Party. And they were really, really smart, very strategic, very military based, very... They had everything that it takes to basically know how to run a government or a state. So you had all these bad guys that were under Saddam Hussein, and then all of these other kind of Al-Qaeda and ISI guys. One of those guys was al-Baghdadi, who is now, and I'll talk about him later, because he is the leader of the caliphate. So when that happened, that caused this next period. A lot of them were let out of prison, and they started just joining forces. Now, a lot of those Ba'athist guys became really radical Islamist while they were in prison. as well as al-Baghdadi. So they joined forces, and basically under Baghdadi's leadership, they started really having a good concept of what it looked like to not just be jihad or fighters, but to also know how to run what they thought would be the caliphate or the Islamic State. So that led to the fourth era, which was the resurgence, and that's from 2010, about right here, to about 2014. Like I said, the secret to the resurgence lies in its alliance with the former Ba'athist officers and the officials who contributed their skills. Salafi, jihadi, and radical Ba'athist united under ideological banner to form an effective leadership corps. Al-Baghdadi developed a powerful support base among alienated Sunnis in Iraq and led a Sunni resistance. Then what happened was in 2013, about 2011, you saw, and again, remember when I said before that when chaos happened, when that U.S. invasion happened in 2003, it basically opened up an area for this radical group to kind of come onto the scene. So the same thing happened in 2011. Baghdadi had then sent a small group of people into Syria. So here's the thing that's frustrating, is the media always says, and Saddam Hussein as well as Assad in Syria, both are considered evil dictators, which is in part very true. They're not very good men. However, under their leadership, under Saddam Hussein's leadership, we saw Christians and Muslims living together in a pretty peaceful manner. Same in Syria. When the Free Syrian Army stood up and wanted kind of Assad to be overthrown, what the Free Syrian Army in 2011 stood for was just freedom. And what happened was al-Baghdadi then sent in his forces, took advantage of another chaotic situation, and that's when we saw al-Nusra Front come onto the scene. Now, this is another very radical Islamist group under Baghdadi's leadership at first, and it caused this another opportunity for this radical thinking to kind of take place, and that's what happened. Now, al-Nusra in 2013 started to get a little bit too much for al-Baghdadi, and so he tried to put them, kind of control them a little bit more, as well as al-Qaeda. So we see one main thing that happens is when al-Qaeda splits from al-Baghdadi's leadership. So at this point, around, let's see, in April of 2013, fearing that al-Nusra was getting too independent, Baghdadi announced the merger of ISI with al-Nusra, and then that's when we saw ISIL, the Islamic State of the Levant. And remember, we talked about Levant meant Greater Syria. So in order to maintain control, he kind of merged these groups together. And then what happened was al-Qaeda didn't agree with al-Baghdadi, and neither did al-Nusra. So both of those two groups split from Baghdadi. Now, when that happened, they proclaimed that they were now the Islamic State of Syria, and they just went on this rampage. So that brings us up to the fifth era, which is 2014 and onwards. And ISIS just conducted this lightning strike. They just went ballistic and took over these main parts of Syria, and then moved into, they seized into Iraq. So they seized places like Mosul, which was a massive thing. And they're very strategic as well. What they did was they seized towns that were either border crossings or places where oil, so this is where they got a lot of their wealth. When they did that, they took over these places that helped them with the oil and things like that. They were able to smuggle it and sell it on the black market, which is where a lot of their money has come from as well. So what is ISIS and what do they want in Iraq? So I've got a quick video to watch.
Once again, Iraq is in complete turmoil. This time it all centers on a group called the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, commonly referred to as ISIS. Now, you'd have to be a scholar on Iraq and Syria to fully understand the this conflict, so we can't explain everything. But we can tell you enough to contextualize all of the news stories you've been hearing lately. So the next time someone says ISIS, you can say, oh yeah, I know those guys. They're horrible terrorists. So who is ISIS and what do they want? Well, they're a jihadist militant group with strongholds in both Iraq and Syria, as you can see on this map. But they're not stopping there. Their goal is to obtain more land so they can create their own nation. Their dream country would look something like this, and it would be called the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. So who are the fighting members of ISIS? Well, that's where it gets complicated. Iraq breaks down into three major groups: Sunni Arabs, Shiite Arabs, and Kurds. ISIS members are Sunni Arabs, as was Saddam Hussein. His regime was Sunni-backed. So does that mean this is just the old guard taking back power? No. Saddam Hussein was a secularist. ISIS, on the other hand, is a militant jihadist group that wants strict Sharia law. This was not the desire of Hussein's regime, although there are signs that some of Saddam's former forces are currently working with ISIS. It's complicated, and in Syria, it gets even more complicated. Syria's war crime committing government is currently fighting a civil war against various rebel groups. ISIS is not one of those rebel groups, but ISIS does want to take over most of Syria, so they're in some degree of armed conflict with both the Syrian government and the rebels. It's pure chaos. In short, ISIS has been committing acts of violence and terrorism in both Syria and Iraq for a while, and they're only now making the news for one simple reason: they're winning. Militarily speaking, ISIS is the most successful jihadist group the world has ever seen. They're collecting taxes from businesses, setting up infrastructure, and releasing quarterly reports. They're gaining strength, so they could be around for a long time, and they may be a bigger threat to the surrounding areas in the long run than Al.
Cool. So basically, that's just a quick kind of who is ISIS, what do they want in Iraq, so why do they kind of move? You said before they're a group that tends to be mobile. They're going outside of just Syria, now they're moving into Iraq. And so you can see that this is something they want to be global. They're going to start in the areas that they're in, but they've also been able to call a lot of people into jihad with them. People from all over the world have come alongside of this group. Al-Bakr Baghdadi, he's the caliph of the caliphate, and he's the one that I've talked about. So he took over after Zakari and after Mazari were killed, and he is now leading what they believe is a pure Islamic State. So let's talk about the ideology and theology of ISIS. We've got to understand, in order to understand them, we have to understand their ideology, their theology, what they think, how they relate to Islam, because the Obama administration in the States, David Cameron, all these other national leaders have basically said that Islamic State is not Muslim, and they disagree with their theology. But we have to understand that their thinking goes back. It is very, very rooted in Islam. It justifies its brutality because of a statement made by Zakari defending his killing of Muslims and non-Muslims. And this is what Zakari had said, and this is what Islamic State kind of founds and bases their theology on as well. He said, the Mujahideen, those engaged in jihad, carry out their operations under strict adherence to the rules of engagement as set forth by Allah, His Messenger, our Prophet Muhammad, and his companions. After all, the Mujahideen took to battlefields only to establish the religion of Allah, of Islam, and to make the word of Allah high above any others, and to gain the pleasure of Allah. So this is one of the founding leaders of Islamic State, Zakari, and this is what Islamic State bases their justification on as well. He also said, the goal must be pursued even if the means to accomplish it affect women, children, and any other passive category specified by our jurisprudence. Now, Obama says that no religion condones the killing of the innocent. But according to Zakari, they don't care if the innocent are killed as long as Allah is pleased and that their religion of Islam is secured. Okay? So even if innocent people are killed, they justify it. Zakaria also said that although spilling sacred Muslim blood is a grave offense, it is not only permissible, but is mandated in order to prevent more serious adversity from happening, stalling or abandoning jihad that is. So some people, some of the modern Muslims, because of these things, they've justified basically killing the innocent, killing other Muslims, and they think that it is what Allah wants, okay? So even though some of these modern Muslims are disagreeing with them, what they're doing is taking exactly what the Quran says and they're living it out, all right? These principles are going to be the hallmark of ISIS. And the Islamic State theology is straightforward. They take the Quran literally. What the Quran says is what they're doing. What Muhammad did as a fighter, as a prophet, is what Islamic State is doing. So they literally laugh at people who think that they are not Islamic and they're not Muslim because their theology is straightforward. To them, it just makes sense, okay? These ideologies argue that there can be no separation between religion and state. And the Islamic State, the reason why it appeals to Muslims everywhere is because they think that they're living jihad, that they are fighting Allah's war, okay? So they're going to be bringing a bunch of people in to fight with them because they think that they're living pure Islam. The reoccurring theme in the history of Islam is through the search for revival that led to the formation of various reform movements. This is where we see, I'm not going to go into this too much, but basically what they've taken from is other movements such as Wahhabism, which is now the ideology of Saudi Arabia, Salafi, which is kind of a Wahhabi plus Salafi movement, basically added the Puritanism and the element of reinterpreting the origins of Islam in order to face the modern world. Salafi Jihadi, which is what Al-Qaeda was, again focusing on returning to pure Islam. And Al-Qaeda, all of these groups have led up to what to Islamic State thinks now. So it's not necessarily a new theology. They're not this movement that is kind of getting their own ideas. They're taking their ideas from history, from what Islam, from people like Saudi Arabia, Salafis, Al-Qaeda have already kind of put in place. And without all of these other things happening, Islamic State wouldn't exist. So you see that what their theology is rooted in is history of Islam. So what we can ask ourselves the question, well, why do they behead? Basically, ISIS beheads because of things that are stated in the Quran. They take literally the verse in the Quran, the Surah 47, which is basically a chapter, verse 4, that says, when you meet the unbelievers, strike their necks. The other verse that they use to support the beheadings is in the Surah 8, verse 60. It says, strike terror into the hearts of the enemies of Allah. So as far as the ISIS is concerned, when they do these beheadings, when they put them on social media, they're living out what the Quran says and what they think is striking terror into the hearts of the enemies. So when people are disgusted at these videos, they are accomplishing what the Quran says, and they think that they're right on track. So another thing to talk about real quickly is the caliphate, and what this means and why it matters. For ISIS, the declaration of the caliphate was a fundamental goal demanded by its theological and ideological beliefs. The caliphate is a form of Islamic government led by the caliph, which is al-Bakr al-Baghdadi. The caliph literally means successor, and caliphs are considered as being the political and religious successors of Muhammad as leader of the entire Muslim community. So when ISIS declared the caliphate, they declared loyalty from all Muslims everywhere to be under the caliphate. So you see groups like Al-Qaeda who have said, nah, we don't really buy into that. And they view that as basically unbelievers, as people who are not loyal. And what ISIS believes is that everybody should declare loyalty to al-Baghdadi and to this Islamic State caliphate. So Sharia law is, they want this entire state or system under Sharia law. Now, if any of you are planning on going on a little wee holiday to the caliphate, here's some things that you need to kind of keep in mind before you go. Women must cover their entire bodies except face and hands. Some must cover their faces as well. Women may not wear makeup or sit in a chair. So all of you ladies in here, not okay. Women may not leave the house without a male relative. Men may not, and this is all stuff in Raqqa, in places where the Islamic State have really issued this caliphate. These are the laws that they have to abide by. Men may not cut their hair, put gel in it, or wear it in a modern style. So anybody out there who's wanting to have the new Justin Bieber haircut, forget it. Barber shops have been shut down, as well as most beauty salons for women. Only women may sell clothing to women. Men may not wear low-hanging jeans.
That's a good one.
Yeah. Most of us are like, thank you. Taxi drivers who overcharge are guilty of theft. They can have their hands amputated or worse. And that's, I just saw on the news the other day where I think this was a guy in Pakistan. And Pakistan is a place where they are under Sharia law as well. And he was sitting in, this is how extreme this is. He was sitting in the mosque, and the mosque had said, how many of you believe in Allah and are believers? And they all raised their hand. And he apparently wasn't paying attention. And so when the imam asked, how many of you are not believers, he had accidentally raised his hand. And basically by doing that, he brought dishonor to Allah. So this young man went back to his house, cut off his hand, and then went back to the mosque. And that was the penance. So they believe in this literal thinking. If you steal something, your hand should be cut off, you know? Drugs, alcohol, and cigarettes are forbidden. This is where smoking actually does kill. If you get caught smoking, there have been stories of people who were smoking and they were caught smoking, and so the ISIS took pliers to the fingers. Other places where people have been caught smoking, where they've put hot burning rods into their mouth. So literally, it's a violation and is forbidden completely. Same with drugs and alcohol. No political parties or armed groups allowed except for ISIS, and those who leave Islam will be killed. And then the last one, I'm not really sure about this one, but those wearing soccer jerseys will receive 8 lashes. So obviously, ISIS is not a fan of footy. So that's some of the things that to keep in mind. If ISIS has its way, and indeed do bring caliphate throughout the Middle East, everything will be under strict Sharia law. Okay, a lot of women as second-class citizens, all of that stuff is legit, and what they want is this pure Sharia law, and they're not okay with people who modern Muslims who have taken Sharia law and kind of picked out some of these real extreme bits to it. And so, for example, letting women go to school and things like that. And the modern Muslims think that some of those things shouldn't be in Sharia law any longer, whereas ISIS believes that what Sharia law has stated is what goes, and there's no variance to that. There's no making allowances for anything just because it's modern. ISIS was also reported to use a bear trap-like device with spikes on women breastfeeding in public. That was in Raqqa. UN officials claimed that women had been burned alive for refusing to take part in extreme sexual acts. And jails are filled with people who are not sufficiently reverent during prayers or had said Allah in a way that authorities of ISIS deemed blasphemous. So that's kind of some of the Sharia law. That's what they believe and what they're implementing in the Islamic State. So just to kind of, before we talk about that, plans for the future. What's on Islamic State's to-do list? What do they want? We've talked about already how their goal is to make an Islamic State throughout the Middle East, other Arab places, and then throughout the world. Constant expansion is crucial for IS, again, supporting what you had asked earlier about them always being on the move. The final goal of bringing all Muslim lands under control and defeating and subjugating all non-Muslims. Another thing that they want to do and what they believe, this is part of Armageddon, is conquering Rome. After Muslims conquer Rome, end times will begin. That's an interesting, if you look, if you have some time later or some other time when you go back home, look up the conquering Rome and Armageddon with Muslims, because it's very interesting. This is a crucial part of Armageddon for them. They believe one of the final battles will happen after they conquer Rome. Increasing assertive and aggressive Muslim populations. Muslim immigrants to Europe and now other places, for example, Sydney, Australia, are encouraged to keep and celebrate their own cultures and traditions rather than embrace those of their new home. Another thing on their to-do list is bringing it all back home. Syrian jihad enabled thousands of Muslims from Europe to become trained and battle-hardened. They learned basic arms shooting combat, assassination techniques, and how to make explosive from homemade materials. And they would bring this training back to their home countries. That was part of the point of some of the trainings that they did with some of the jihadis who had come over, so that they could take them back into their home countries. Now, before we get all worried about refugees and things like that coming into our countries, I do want you to understand that the United Nations and when refugees come in, all of them are vetted, and they go through a lot of series of checks and things like that. So it's not something to be necessarily afraid of. We just need to understand that that is part of what they do, is they want people to go back into these other countries with these skills. We saw that when Charlie Hebdo happened in Paris. They said there are small armies of ISIS within every country of Europe by late 2014, and the intelligent agencies didn't even know about it. January 2015 was when the world first discovered that this was happening, because we saw the attacks in Paris happen, and that was kind of a wake-up call that we do need to be aware of what ISIS plans, and that they are not just in Syria and not just in Iraq, that they are wanting it to be global. So how do we respond? I think one of the biggest things is we have this thing that thinks that if we just send the United States or Russia or other people in and bomb the heck out of ISIS, that it's going to be obliterated. And that's not the solution, because the ideology is there. The ideology is rooted in people's hearts and minds, okay? So even when ISIS was attacked, when Zakaria was killed, we saw his ideology continue, right? So it's not just defeating ISIS on a war level. It's defeating this ideology. It's teaching young Muslims that this isn't the right ideology. So there's all of that we can kind of think about. But the biggest thing for us and our challenge and how we respond is the most important. And for us, I think our biggest thing is prayer. That is what is above all. And that is what we serve a God who is greater than he in the world. He is a God who is bigger than ISIS, a God who is bigger than this ideology. When we saw the 21 men marched out on that beach and executed for their faith, ISIS had declared war on Christianity. The message was to those believers of the cross. Now, when this happened, a young man was asked to write a letter back to ISIS, a response back to ISIS. And his response, when he first started writing it, was filled with hatred and wanted justice. And as he was writing his response, he was convicted by the Holy Spirit. Because the thing is that even the worst ISIS person, the one who hates Christians the most, the one who hates and kills and beheads, is still a child of God, is still loved by Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ still died for him. So when he was writing this letter back to ISIS, it originally started with vengeance and hatred and kind of a we will get you back kind of thing. God really took a hold of him and changed his thinking. And it's just incredible. The part of that gets me the most is the part that says we are no different from the worst jihadist apart from the blood of Christ Jesus. I believe that God wants to do something in the lives of ISIS and the lives of the worst, the way that he did with Paul on the road to Damascus. You know, we saw that story in the Bible where Paul was confronted by Jesus Christ. Paul was the worst of the worst. He loved persecuting Christians. And ISIS is the same. They're just blinded by this hatred, by this theology and ideology that is full of hatred and void of love. But the God that we believe in is a God of love. So what I want to do today and how I want to end this session, because it's really heavy. You know, we talk about ISIS and we see ISIS and how just perverted and how dark this theology and ideology actually is. But I want to pray for them, because I really believe that the prayers of a righteous person are powerful and effective, and that the Bible tells us to pray for our enemies, the worst enemies. And ISIS is just that. And that video is just, it moves you, because it reminds us that ISIS is loved by God just as much as God loves us. And as Christians, and if we want to respond to who ISIS is and what they're doing, our response must be out of love and prayer and grace and truth. And so let's take a few moments and just and pray for ISIS, to pray for this ideology to be broken, for the leaders of ISIS to have a real revelation of who God is. And then I'll close this in prayer, and then also give you guys a chance to ask some more questions. God, thank you so much for how much you love us, and not just how much you love us, but how much you even love ISIS and some of the most horrible people that we can think of. You just, you love them. So Lord, help us as we go forward today to continue to learn more about this group, so that we can know how to love them better. Lord, I pray for the worst of the worst leaders, those ones who are beheading. I pray for the people who followed Jihadi John and his death and how he was glorified in that. Lord, I pray that people will be aware of how dark he actually was, and that you will just help us to understand and to have truth, but also to have grace in the midst of all of this. Lord, I pray for leaders of our nations, that they will understand and know how to combat this group. And Lord, I pray for us that as we have conversations with people, that you help us to have these conversations and be more aware of who ISIS is, and how we can have really good conversations with people about you as well. Lord, we love you so much, and we thank you for the opportunity that we have to serve you and love you. And we just pray that this darkness be broken, and that the Christians who are living in the midst of the Middle East at the moment and their lives, how they've been just uprooted and flipped upside down, that you will give them strength and courage in the midst of all the fighting and all of the hardness that they have to endure every day. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Do you?
So just open it up for a bit of questions before we go. But
Can we see that again?
do you want to watch it again?
I would like to. I don't know
Yeah,
if
I'll-
anyone else wants to.
I'll show it again, kind of when we end, and if you guys want to stay and watch it, we can.
Yes.
One of the things that you could do is start prayer groups to pray for the persecuted church within your communities as well. I think that constant prayer for people in ISIS, that's a super important thing. So just like what you guys are doing in Palmerston North, maybe take that idea and start it in your communities as well.
Can I just add to that? I was asked to pray many years ago. One of the many years to pray for people behind the Iron Curtain, and we saw
Oh, yeah.
that.
Yeah,
This is the encouragement.
yeah, absolutely.
This might be a bit left field sort of question, but I've got a friend who's a deep Christian now who was a Muslim, grew up in Africa,
Uh-huh.
and she said that for them the Quran was very peaceful and the people were really beautiful. So
Yeah,
how can they
yeah.
be so? How can they be so fundamental in what they read,
Yeah.
and how can it be so different to how she grew up?
Yeah, good. That's a good question. She basically asked, she was saying that there are a lot of Muslims who are peaceful, who do believe in peace, and that's a lot of the modern kind of Islamic thinking is more of a peaceful. And many Muslims that we will meet on the street, in our neighborhoods, they are very lovely people. It's not all Muslims who think the same way, just like not all Christians think the same way. We've got some extreme, you see the televangelists and some people whose ideologies and theology is just not anything like what our Bible talks about. You know, it's the same thing with Muslims. The ISIS, they are very radical Islamist group, and they believe what the Quran says, and they take it literally. Whereas a lot of modern Muslims, even the Sharia law, they've kind of changed it to adapt to modern society. So most of the people who are more peaceful are more modern Muslims who don't believe necessarily that the Quran should be taken as literally. Just like we don't just read the Old Testament and, you know, fight just like we saw in the Old Testament Bible, you know, that when we read that, you see a lot of fighting and war as well. So it's that same kind of modern thinking that some Muslims are very peaceful. And that's what a lot of Muslim people are saying as well. They're saying that the Islamic State is not Muslim for that same reason.
Yeah.
Just a suggestion. I'm just reading a book by Lord Jonathan Sacks, who is the previous chief rabbi in the UK, who has written a book called Not in God's Name.
Yeah.
And I'm only 3/4 of the way through, so I can't give you the end. But it actually portrays how we got to where we got to in a philosophical way as well as a geopolitical way. But it then goes into the underpinnings of the story of the Old Testament, which leads you into a consideration of how different parties view where they're at.
Yeah.
Towards the end, he seeks to reconcile it, I haven't got to that bit yet.
What's the book called?
Not in God's Name.
That's a good one. This is Patrick Sadale. He is the director, was the international director of Barnabas. This book is an excellent book. A lot of the content that I talked about today was taken from this book. So if you guys want a more in-depth study on Islamic State, definitely pick this up from the back of the Barnabas Fund stand. And there's other really good books about Islamic State as well that will help you understand it better.
Just a comment, really. I'm not totally convinced that Islam does negotiate, actually.
Yeah.
So to contextualise that, just 3 quick comments. One, in Christchurch before the earthquakes, the Islamic population had already got strong enough to be able to say to the council, please close the pool so that our women can swim and not be seen by the infidel.
Yeah.
Right. In England, in many of the major cities now, there are Sharia law councils, which is important because the purpose of the Sharia law council is to allow exemptions, for example, for a 15-year-old girl to be married. Okay. The point of living in England and in the Western democratic society that was birthed in the Westminster system fell out of the Magna Carta, which said we're all equal before the law of law. Right? In modern contemporary society, actually we're not. And we're allowing, even within a democratic society founded on the Magna Carta and equality before the law, to isolate and make people not equal. And that's in contemporary society. You go onto the English Law Society website, the Bastion, and there's a lot of advice on how you give advice in order to comply with Sharia obligations and trusts and rules, for example, which takes you into an interesting conversation about what's the contemporary status of the rights of women, even in our society. So, and my last comment is, what you don't hear are the leaders of the Islamic world talking about how reasonable Islam is.
Yeah.
And even in democracies, you don't hear the leaders of the mosques coming out and saying, actually, this is how it is, we're a peaceful people, and why the silence? So I'm a little thoughtful. I know that there is moderation and there is a broad conversation here.
Yeah.
But there are aspects of dissonance that I think should make us a bit thoughtful.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that it's beneficial for all of us in here to get a bit more understanding of Islam. Today was basically about Islamic State and what their theology is, but I think in order to understand Islamic State, we do have to understand a bit more about what the majority Muslim or what the mainstream Muslim thinks as well. And I think there's a lot of truth to what you said. I do think that even though they consider themselves peaceful, there are so many contradictions to that as well in the Quran. So,
I just think, really on that last point, we have to be careful about what we hear in the media. a few years ago there was that American pastor who got quite a bit of media attention by burning the Quran. And there was quite a bit of work done at an international leader, church leader stage to try and stop that happening. A pastor in the church of 30 people got worldwide attention, but no one heard the voices of realism and moderation against that. And I think there is that issue that the media is only going to tell us one part of the picture.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And when he did burn that Quran, it caused riots all over other parts of the world, and a lot of Christians were killed, regardless of if they had anything to do with that or not. If you do want to get more information, the magazine that we offer is really good. We've got a pull-out that always talks about something that has to do with Islam. So most of the countries, the reason why we talk about Islam mostly is because that's where the majority of Christian that we work with, that's a majority of